Hello, everyone. Good afternoon and welcome in this GMF digital event. I am Bruno Lété, a senior fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I'm very pleased that today we have the pleasure to welcome our panelists and our viewers on both sides of the Atlantic. So good afternoon, Europe. Good morning, America. And for my own part, greetings indeed from sunny Brussels. The title of our discussion today is Putin's Offset, the Kremlin's Geopolitical Adaptations since 2014. It's a topic that GMF cares much about. And as a transatlantic organization, we have always looked to synchronize European and American responses to the challenges that we face in this regard. The reason for the event today is actually a great report recently published by Nataliya Bugayova, who is also with us today. She has done an in-depth study of how Russian tactics and geopolitical strategy have evolved over the course of the past year. So that will serve as a source of inspiration for our discussion today. It is also why I'm grateful for the partnership with the Institute for the Study of War in this event. And Kimberly Kagan, the president of the Institute, is also kind enough to be present with us today. So it is my distinct pleasure to give you the floor, Kim, for some remarks.
Bruno, thank you very much. It is such a great pleasure to be today with this incredible transatlantic audience. I too would like to welcome our friends and colleagues in Europe and our friends and colleagues here in America to thank you for participating in this event and to thank GMF for co-hosting what is sure to be a robust discussion of what is such an important issue for both the United States and our European allies. It is important to us at the Institute for the Study of War actually to embrace the extraordinary potential of our transatlantic alliance and to discuss the ways we can respond in common to the challenges that we face in common. And that is why I'm so privileged, really, to be here with you. Thank you, Bruno, and thank you for spotlighting the work of the incredible Nataliya Bugayova, who has been with the ISW team for a number of years and who is now our non-resident research fellow working on Russia. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you.
My gratitude to you, Kim, as well, and thanks for joining in from the other side of the Atlantic. The goal of today's conversation is actually very straightforward. We want to better understand how Russia has adapted its strategies since the Kremlin invaded Ukraine in 2014, and President Putin is indeed trying to create an international environment that foster Russian interests, give Moscow a sense of legitimacy. And he does that through many different ways, the projection of narratives, alliances, but also hard military power. And the list of tools is longer. So we also have to be a little bit honest. President Putin has actually done so on several occasions, not unsuccessfully. Also here in the West, Russia has succeeded in a number of occasions to interfere with our societies and disrupt our sense of security. And for other countries, like Ukraine, for instance, or Syria, the implications even went beyond, as they had to face the very real consequences of Russian geopolitical ambitions. So I guess that's a little bit what we want to ask ourselves today. What is Putin's center of gravity? Well, what is the base he builds on to project power? What are the blind spots of Russian power? I mean, do we actually understand the weaknesses, and what lessons did we learn, for instance, in Ukraine? What are the tools that we have at hand to deter Russia's ambition, and how resilient is Russia vis-a-vis our Western tools? That would be an interesting question as well. And maybe one last thought, really to provoke your brains here, is now that Putin seems to be set to remain in power at least until 2036. Yeah, how will Russian foreign policy actually evolve? I mean, what should we brace for in Europe, in the United States, in our transatlantic community? So that's a little bit what I was thinking about. And fortunately, I do not need to answer all these difficult questions by myself. I have a very distinct panel of experts and practitioners here that joined today, and I will really briefly introduce all of you. First of all, Nataliya Bugayova, who is a senior fellow with the Institute for the Study of War, and as we already said, the brilliant author of the report we're discussing today. Teija Tiilikainen, I hope my pronunciation is correct. I did brush up my Finnish a little bit, is the director of the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats. Thank you very much for being with us today. Ben Hodges, the Pershing Chair in Strategic Studies at the Center for European Policy Analysis. Welcome. You are also, of course, a former commander of the US Army in Europe. And last but not least, Oksana, Syroid, the co-chair of the Lviv Security Forum, but you are also the leader of the Samopomich Union political party in Ukraine. So to you as well, dear Oksana, thanks very much for being with us. Before we kickstart this conversation, perhaps just a few house rules. We are on the record, so we'll do a first round of interventions with all the speakers very shortly, but it's really is meant to be an interactive exercise. So I encourage all of you, our viewers, to take full advantage of the Zoom interaction functions. There's a Q&A button on the bottom of your screen, as most of you already know. I will be closely monitoring that feed and transfer your questions to the panelists. So now that this is done, let me turn, first of all, perhaps to you, Nataliya, and I think it would be wonderful to kickstart this conversation if you could share the main conclusions of your study. So Nataliya, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bruno. It's an honor to be here. I'd like to start by saying that the West has an opportunity to counter the Russian challenge, but it's not well positioned to do so now for two reasons. One, I think because there are a number of blind spots that the West has in which Putin gains. And secondly, because the West continues to misunderstand sometimes the nature of the challenge, and more specifically in the ways in which Putin advances or fails, what he prioritizes, and more specifically how he adapts. It has been 6 years since Crimea. His goals remained consistent. However, he has recalibrated his approaches in part to adapt to the new environment, but in part to actually offset the pressures coming from the West. I'll highlight three to frame the conversation, and we can dive more into them during the Q&A. So first, information environment is key. And the Kremlin is investing heavily in its ability to shape perceptions both inside of Russia, but also globally. From trying to build out a global media conglomerate around the world to formally incorporating the information confrontation mandate in Russia's security services and military. And there are numerous other efforts in this regard. Why such emphasis on information? I think there are a couple important reasons that are worthy highlighting. So first, I think it's a reflection of the Kremlin's evolving assessment of the threat environment and conviction that the threats to Russia will emanate from the information space. Secondly, I think there are some lessons learned the Kremlin has done after especially operations in Ukraine, where it simply, if you remember, ran out of information cover in 2014 to advance its operation in a hybrid way without launching a full-fledged offensive in Ukraine, because it grossly overestimated how much population would actually support it. And then I think finally, it goes back to the point of the center of gravity. I think Putin is increasingly reliant on ability to shape perceptions in order to advance his goals, because his actual power is limited and in some cases diminishing. Which brings me to kind of the second point and the second element of his offsetting tactics, if you will, that we've observed since 2014 is this effort to invest in building out a web of coalitions around Russia. So we've seen a lot of investment in trying to link or expand Russia-linked organizations such as Eurasian Economic Union, CSTO, and others, but also sign numerous partnerships agreements around the world in areas from media to cybersecurity. And I think the Kremlin is trying to create this web to expand its access to resources, but more importantly, perhaps legitimacy, so it can pump its narrative through a wider web of coalition. But I think it's not all narrative and it's not all perceptions, even though those are extremely important amplifiers of his power. I think Russia has some limited but real source of power. And a third effort that we've observed Putin really investing in since 2014 is expanding Russia's security space strategically, but in a limited fashion. More precisely, expanding military basing, whether it's in Crimea, in the Arctic, in the Middle East. But I think there are two things that are important here, and I want to quickly share this graphic with you. It's about how I conceptualize how Russia is expanding its security space. It's still trying to do it on the cheap, meaning without bankrupting itself, and it's trying to offset the limits with also coalitions, whether it's trying to pull in Belarus forces of the former Soviet Union, as we observe now in Belarus, into its frameworks, or trying to tie peacekeeping operations of the CSTO to UN mandate to expand its legitimacy. And I think that's actually an effort we should be all watching. Or it's back in 2015 trying to pull US into counterterrorism framework in Syria. It's all a way to amplify and offset the limits of Russia's real power. So I want to conclude, I think, by saying that a lot of these adaptations, and there are a lot more, have allowed to some extent Putin to offset the pressures, but also to play weak hand well, but his hand remains bad. And in my assessment, the gap between his goals and his resources will continue to grow. It doesn't necessarily mean that his power will be threatened, neither it means that he will be more dangerous. However, it does mean that he will increasingly be reliant on asymmetries to achieve his goals, and increasingly reliant on tools other than real power to achieve his goals, which I think does provide an opportunity for the West, for Ukraine to counter the Russian challenge. So I'll open with that and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Natalia. And you gave us a lot of information, a lot of food for thought. And I really want to get back to some of your ideas. I mean, I read the report and it was really good. So I can only encourage our viewers also to do the same. So thanks for your points. Let me turn to Teija next, because I think that some or maybe even all of the issues that Natalia just mentioned, you must be dealing with those topics at the center of excellence. But what I was thinking is that even though all these points seem new, they're not that new actually. I mean, hybrid warfare has been around for quite a while. I mean, it's not that modern, but somehow we struggle in Europe and the United States to deal with this. So what is new? What is Russia doing differently today that we struggle so much?
Many thanks, Bruno. Can you hear me? So does my microphone function? That's very good. Let me just briefly put the Russian hybrid action into a slightly bigger picture, because I want to start by saying that Russia is inherently a weakened power that tries to get back its global position, the position that it used to have during the Soviet era or even earlier. And as its resources, economic, or even in some respects, military, political resources anyway, are limited, it has to use the toolbox that it has available. And that is pretty much its military might and the hybrid toolbox. Still, the Russian key approach to international affairs is revisionist. So it tries to change the international system to its own benefit. I think this is very crucial when we analyze Russian policies. So how does it try to change the international system? It tries to steer the international system towards a multipolar system where it would be the strongest states, Russia included, that would create a leading concert to rule the world. So this brings us back to the 19th century world with a concert of big powers. So our understanding of multilateralism and these kinds of setups where Russia is just one middle-sized power among many others does not suit the Russian identity of a worldview. So Putin wants to stand side by side with the other great power leaders to take key decisions globally. To such a great power position belongs also a recognized possibility to have spheres of interest, possibility to affect the policies of neighboring countries to one's own benefit. So to be strong, Russia has to weaken the others. And this is how we are approaching the field of hybrid action here. It has to weaken the system on which the strength of its competitors is based upon. That's the key Russian philosophy. So it wants to weaken the EU, it wants to weaken NATO, the transatlantic alliance, in order to strengthen its own position. And it has two toolboxes, as I said, as I see them. It's military might that it is ready to use. We see it in the Syrian theater, we see it in the eastern Ukraine, but it also threatens with the use of military might. So both as a political and military tool, it wants to show capability. The other toolbox is what we call the various forms of hybrid action. All these non-conventional instruments which do not require huge economic or political potential. Disinformation, critical infrastructure disturbances and attacks, including cyber. And also something that we call here lawfare, so the use of law and legal frameworks for strategic purposes. To exert power, this is to exert power by contesting the conventional rules of the game, to take advantage of Western vulnerabilities, and these are the weak spots we are talking about here. Their open economies, open information space, and open civil societies. So this is how I understand the goal and means by Russia. It wants to be strong, it wants to be a leading power, but the normal resources of international politics do not allow it to take this position. So that's why it looks for different avenues, and the non-conventional threats provided a very good toolbox. I will conclude with some recommendations to us in the Western community concerning how to counter it. So we need to play this game with our rules. We should not give Russia the recognition it longs for. So we shouldn't be misled by its policies. We should not make compromises from our values or partnerships. And finally, as it is well, I think, stressed in this report, we should not let Russia to dominate the narrative on European or transatlantic security, but keep the narrative of our role and efficiency in our own hands. And we should, of course, do it together in our organizations. Thank you.
And thank you for actually also concluding with some concrete recommendations. That's always what we're looking for as well. So thanks for that. Next, I would like to turn to Ben and really also perhaps hear from you a little bit more about our transatlantic response to this subject. Maybe also a little bit from a military hard power perspective. Is Russia really this middle-sized power that we just mentioned? I mean, how do you assess Russian power? And if Russia is seeking to weaken the other, as Teija mentioned, did it succeed to weaken us, the EU, NATO, the United States? How do you see this, Ben?
Thanks, and I'm thrilled to be able to follow Natalia and Teija, some superb insights as well as recommendations, and I'd like to reinforce what they've said. I'm reluctant to call Russia a mid-sized power when they have thousands of nuclear weapons and are putting most of their resources into modernizing their military, and of course they have unlimited natural resources. So while they've got plenty of problems, I think it's always a mistake when some of our Western European friends and even Americans tend to dismiss Russia as, well, they have the GDP the size of Italy. I mean, that's absolutely totally irrelevant when you consider how Russia uses power and what Russia's objectives are. Look, we are in the era of great power competition, and I know this phrase gets used a lot, but it's actually a very useful phrase when you break it down and think about what great power competition means. And I believe that great power competition actually prevents great power conflict if you compete in the diplomatic space, the information space, the military space, and the economic space, in all four domains. And then you could, I'm glad that Teija brought up lawfare. That's becoming maybe its own sort of domain that straddles a little bit the information space and the diplomatic space. The point is to compete. If you don't compete, then you are conveying to the Kremlin, in this case, or to the Chinese Communist Party or other adversaries, potential adversaries, that you don't care, that it doesn't matter. The same thing as when you put a red line and then don't do anything when the red line is crossed, you have signaled that you're not going to do something about it, and that potentially leads to misunderstandings, miscalculations, and conflict. And that's been our problem too long when dealing with the Kremlin, particularly in the Black Sea region. I think that the Black Sea region is, if the Kremlin was forced to choose what's the most important place on their entire perimeter, it's going to be the Black Sea region, because the Black Sea region is what allows them to do everything that they're doing, not just in the Caucasus and in the Balkans and in Ukraine, but also in Syria, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in Libya. The Black Sea is an extension of the Mediterranean Sea. It's all really one body of water that's connected by the Turkish Straits. And that's why it's so important to them and why they're willing to use force, as they've done against the Ukrainian Navy, against Ukraine, against Georgia. And then, of course, they threaten everybody else, and they still have 2,500 peacekeepers sitting in Transnistria. So the Black Sea, then, we should look at it as the cauldron of competition. This is the place where we have got to compete in all of these categories, not just the military, but actually I think the information space and the diplomatic space is even more important, and especially in the economic space. That private investment, if you get German and Dutch companies, Belgian companies investing in Georgia, for example, in the port of Anaklia, that's the last thing the Kremlin wants, is Western European countries having money invested in Georgia, because then they're going to start paying attention to the administrative lines around Abkhazia and South Ossetia moving around. And they're like, wait, why do we have 10,000 Russian troops sitting in sovereign Georgian territory? Or people start paying attention to the fact that Russia's illegal annexation and occupation of Crimea, and now they're claiming exclusive economic zone around Crimea as if it was legitimate sovereign Russian territory that bumps up against Romanian exclusive economic zone. There's a problem here. And so that's why the West has got to compete in this space. I think we have got to make sure that in every single possible category, we demonstrate that we, the West, are not going to ever, ever, ever acknowledge Russia's annexation of Crimea. That means no local votes. Well, you cannot allow a ship that sails from any port in Crimea to come to a European port, for example. It should be declared contraband and illegal. These are the kind of things that when you add them together, that demonstrates that we're not going to accept it. And I think we have to have a long-term view. I was a lieutenant in Germany about 100 years ago, and I can remember thinking, wow, well, East and West Germany, are they going to be divided forever? Thank God we all persisted, the Germans as well as all of our allies, we persisted, and now Germany's reunified. The United States never acknowledged the Soviet Union's annexation of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, never. And that's the way we have to think about Crimea.
Thank you, Ben. Sorry, I was struggling with my mic, but thank you for your remarks. I really liked it. I mean, thanks for going beyond just the tanks, the guns, the missiles. You know, you mentioned the economic space, and this is actually a domain where we can win. Absolutely, I agree with you. Last but not least, again, Oksana, welcome as well to you, and you are with us from Ukraine. So, you know, have you seen a different strategy that the Russians are using since 2014? What has changed? Has nothing changed? And what lessons can we learn from Ukraine in this regard?
Thank you very much, Bruno, and it's a great pleasure and opportunity for me to share my thoughts with such a distinct audience. It's very easy for me to speak after such fantastic presenters, and especially after Ben, who actually started from Ukraine, finished on Ukraine as well. And I think it's quite fair, because I do agree with the statement that Black Sea is actually one of the ultimate goal of the struggle. And this goal hasn't been changed for the last 350 years. So if you look at the history of Russia, actually they've been fighting for the control of the Baltic and the Black Sea and Baltic Sea. So keep it in mind. So first Black and then Baltic Sea to be the target. But I would like to mention a few things about the Ukrainian experience, unfortunately, we are kind of the proving ground of Russian aggression, how it's working. But also, unfortunately, Ukrainian experience to some extent is a proving ground of the mistakes that specific countries and international community is doing and how it helps Russia. So I would like to mention a few of them and to warn us how and what should be done instead. First of all, I like that Teija already mentioned values, but actually values, this is also one of the biggest targets of Putin and of Russia. And unfortunately, we are helping them to undermine those values. The very, very vivid and picturesque example is the bringing back Russian delegation to the Council of Europe. They were expelled, excluded because of the breach of the international order and of the illegal annexation of Crimea and of the occupation of the east of Ukraine. And they are brought back because they are paying money. So actually, this is how the European values were sold out in the extent of the financial contributions. Then you express to Kremlin and to Putin that actually you can trade your values for money. The second example is actually operation of the so-called Russian Orthodox Church and Russian NGOs, because they are not the religious or civil society institution. They are just the extension of FSB, and they are promoting specifically the agenda of Kremlin and of the FSB. That's why if we will pretend that Russian Orthodox Church belongs to the freedom of religion and Russian NGOs belongs to the civil society sector, then we are done, because eventually they will be winning. The second big pillar is the bargaining of land. Russia is trapping land or invading pieces of land of the territory just to bargain. This is what happened on Donbass. They don't need Donbass. They don't need the eastern part of Ukraine. They need it for political reason, and they are bargaining. And unfortunately, what the West and Ukrainian government is doing, they are playing this game. And Minsk is part of this game. This is bargaining the land for the loss of the sovereignty and actually independence and political control over the country. So this is not the first time Russia is doing this, and we have to learn this lesson: never bargain piece of the territory for your independence and sovereignty. Point number 3: money. And money, Russia is actually using this very smart, so they are allowing businessmen in the country or like Ukrainian oligarchs to have access to natural resources, to critical infrastructure, including banks and media and raw resources. So if you allow Russia to invest in your media, to keep money in your bank, don't expect that you will come to Russia, because it means that Russia is countering you. And if you want to come to Russia, first take away Russian money of your banks and get them out of your critical infrastructure, including media. And the last but not least, this is political structure. And this is similar to the point number one, that politicians and political parties that are funded by Russia, they do not represent your citizens. They represent the interest of the FSB and of the Kremlin. And if you pretend, and until you pretend that those political parties, and they exist in each of the European countries, and you know this, and until you pretend that they are part of political spectrum, Russia will be winning. So we all have to come to this. We have this in Ukraine, and you have it as well. So far, that's it. I will be happy also to answer the additional question. Thank you.
That's it, but it's already a lot. So thank you very much for that, dear Oksana. In the meantime, so I thank to all of you. I think that your remarks really served as a fabulous bird's eye overview of what we wanted to discuss. And I know I have a lot of questions to ask as a follow-up, but I see that the Q&A feed is already starting to pump questions in our discussion. So I really want to take some of the questions that were raised by some of our participants. The first one I think is quite interesting, and it really relates to what Mr. George Barros and Mr. Anna Widner is asking, and it goes to you, Natalia, and the so-called battle for the minds. You mentioned that that Russia at least perceives one of the threats to its security emanating from information space, and that is one of the domains where we need to compete. But the questions being asked is, how effectively can we compete if some of our own citizens are already being influenced? And it would also entail that probably there should be a unified European or transatlantic approach towards Russia. So how do we win this battle in the information space?
Sure, no, thank you. This is a great question. I'll mention 2 points. First, I think both West and also, even if you look at Ukraine, it has similar blind spots. And I think the main one is being that we tend to ignore Russia's trivial activities, but they're the ones that actually matter. If you recall, it was actually 2004 when the Kremlin started to set up the first separatist structures in Ukraine and launch some of its active information operations in Ukraine. And it was a decade of subversive and information action that preceded the hybrid operation in 2014. I think one of the key in countering Russia effectively in the information space is twofold. One, it's developing strategic intelligence capabilities to recognize the slow creep before it becomes Russia's strategic advantage. And I think it's not just government, but also involving civil society in it. Because actually in Ukraine, now it has been 7 wars going on for almost 7 years, society has proven that it can spot Russia's information operations early enough to call some of its actions. Even earlier this or previous year, Ukraine's civil society stopped quite a few of manipulations of trying to push Ukrainian government into an unfavorable Russia peace deal. So I think we already have something to work with to call Russia's bluff to information space, but the key, you have to call it early. I think second point is, I think we often define Russia's information ops too narrowly. We focus too much on simply information tools. But in fact, what I was talking about, the coalitions, that is also part of the information space. They build coalition and they circle narratives through them. Military action is also often used by Russia to generate perceptual effects. Cyber operations also. So I think it's actually very key for us to redefine definition and focus on it as a perception space with a focus on effects, not efforts. And that goes back to General Hodges' point, competing with various economic and other planes. I still think the West too often separates it out too much. It will compete in either this plane or that plane, but I think we need to also refocus and take Russia for what it is, meaning a state that dynamically employs whatever tools it deems necessary for its foreign policy, whether they're military, whether they're economic. I think we too often separate out tools of also foreign policy. I think West sometimes falls for the narrative business is just business for Russia. So I think, consolidating that and countering Russia the way it operates, I think it's key.
Thank you. Teija, can I also turn to you to comment on this briefly? I mean, are we in Europe ready to win this information warfare? Are we united?
Exactly, that's the key question, because to win this information game, we should be united. We should have a unified narrative, and we should not let Russia to use the lack of unity that exists. Many times it's on much smaller issues amongst us in the European Union or transatlantic community. But I also want to stress that we really need to plan carefully how to counter disinformation and these information campaigns that might also be very long-term information campaigns. So we have these more daily campaigns of disinformation flows, where also, of course, the social media platforms play an important role. So we need many actors to counter the Russian action. But there is also a nasty, more long-term form of information campaigns that we could use, that we could call history politics. So the rewriting of Russian history books to the advantage of Russian strength and unity, and to the disadvantage of West. This is I feel, also one form of disinformation which has much more long-term consequences, as it educates younger Russian generations to a certain negative understanding of the West as such, democracy and the values of the West. So really we have to build on our own resilience, but also find the right tools to counter these disinformation campaigns. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am scrolling through the timeline and the question Q&A line, sorry, which is also a timeline in a sense. But there's a question for you, Oksana. Actually, many different questions addressing the same topic, and it's about how successful Russia actually is in discrediting our democracy. How would you assess Russian efforts in this domain? There is, for instance, Mr. Wolfgang Musinger, who is asking how effective it is not to allow right-wing parties. I mean, is this not discrediting our own values in a certain sense? So how do you see this, Oksana?
This is a very good question, and there is no simple answer to this. But I think this is the high time for all people of goodwill, and first of all, European people of European countries, the Council of Europe, to reconsider how we interpret and how we implement the freedoms that are the major success of Western civilization. So we value this civilization for the freedoms, but Russia is using other interpretation of this freedom to undermine our freedoms. So in principle, we have to reconsider this and to put the barriers and limits. For example, freedom of media, whether the bots in the Facebook can be considered as freedom of media. Or maybe we should speak about and start speaking about banning even the possibility of having the fake accounts, and somebody should be punished for this. Because, for example, I've been personally attacked for the number of times by Russian bots in the Facebook, and I have to tell you, this is very painful, because if they call you that you are whore, you know, and you have hundreds of comments like this and 100 likes of each comment, and your friends and relatives, they are reading this, it is sensitive and you have nobody to sue. So we have to consider how to interpret those freedoms. The freedom of speech, the same, the freedom of political parties. If the party is funded by the foreign agent that is actually the adversary of your values, this party does not represent the freedom of politics, the freedom of political parties and political unions. And the freedom of capital, the same. Is Russian capital can enjoy the freedom of capital movement that is provided by the European Union if they undermine the European Union per se, that maybe it has to be banned. So I would suggest that it's a high time to start the dialogue on the understanding of those freedoms that are the major the precious value of the European civilization.
Okay. Thank you, Oksana. Next, and perhaps dear Ben and Kimberly, I also want to pull you in this one. We have a question from Thomas Brandner, who actually thinks that we are advocating a strategy of relentless and uncompromising confrontation. So what are the risks here if we behave that way? Mr. Brandner ends with asking, can NATO win a conventional war against Russia? Maybe first Ben, then you, Kimberly. Yeah.
Of course, I'm happy to defer to Kimberly as the host.
Thank you very much. Of course, I would like your experienced advice on the question of NATO, but on the question of what this distinguished group of panelists is advocating, I can't speak for all of them, but I do think it's important to say that this is not unrelenting confrontation by Europe or by the United States against Russia. It is actually a response to Russian confrontation and indeed Russian outright military aggression against states around its borders, including the illegal occupation of Crimea and the continued campaign to deprive Ukraine of territory that it is actually sovereign territory of Ukraine. And so what we're talking about here is recognizing rather the way in which Russia uses long planned and long built information operations, perceptions of the legitimacy of its alliance, and campaigns to obfuscate its own behavior. And what I hear from this panel, and certainly from Natalia's paper, is the importance actually of exposing these patterns of Russian engagement so that we do not foolishly accept all of the terms on which Russia engages, but rather expose those terms, expose the tools that it is using to allow us to respond effectively as an alliance and as individual states and as democratic citizens.
So let me then pile on to what Kimberly has said. First of all, And Thomas, this is actually, I think this is the key question. I wish that we had a relentless, uncompromising confrontation. If it was relentless, if it was uncompromising, then I guarantee you would see a dramatic reduction in what the Kremlin does. They absolutely despise weakness and they only respect strength. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be having negotiations and dialogue. Of course, people would expect that, but you do that from a position of strength. And when what they see from us is inconsistent and not relentless. They see weaknesses and vulnerabilities when they see that the alliance, our great alliance, the most successful alliance in the history of the world, not perfect, but the most successful, when they see cracks in the cohesion, whether it's because the American commitment seems unclear or somebody else calls it brain dead or others don't live up to their expectations for readiness, that creates vulnerability. Think about this. The constant narrative from the Kremlin is always they have no choice but to respond to NATO's encroachment, the aggression of the West. The West lied. During the Cold War, the United States Army had almost 300,000 troops in Europe, mostly in Germany. Today, we have about 35,000, so 10% of what we used to have. Russia's attack on Georgia, Russia's attack on Ukraine, Russia supported the Assad regime in Syria. All that happened after the last US Army armored brigade left Europe. So when we were at our weakest is when all of this stuff happened. The Kremlin knows that the safest part of their border is the part that touches NATO and Finland. That's the safest part of it. That's the one place they know they will never be attacked from. But what parts of the Russian military, where are they most concentrated? The Western Military District. Why is that? That's for their own domestic purposes. And I think we have to be clear. If you don't acknowledge there's a threat, then you're never going to compete. And frankly, many of our political leaders are unwilling to acknowledge the threat because they don't want to have to do something about it, which is what they would be required to do. Last thing I'll say, your question, impounding Russian ships. So let me be more clear. I didn't say we should impound ships coming from a Crimean port, but they should never be allowed to enter a European port. If they sail from Crimea, they should not be allowed to enter. This is basic maritime law, and the West needs to enforce the law and hold Russia accountable. Would NATO be able to win a conventional war? Of course we would. 30 nations to 1. That's exactly why the Kremlin does everything they can to stay below the threshold of ever getting into a conventional conflict. And the best way we prevent that conflict is by being ready to always fight and win one.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much both for your remarks. And I understand the point that you make here, that strength will lead to better dialogue in a certain sense. But we do have questions from the audience who may not necessarily agree with this point. And I'm reading some of them here. We have two particular questions here, and it's actually pretty interesting because it also leads to the argument that we often hear, especially in Europe and in Western Europe, that we cannot provoke Russia because that will actually lead to a worse dialogue. And there's a question here like, how do we talk with the opposition in Belarus without provoking Russia? How do we enlarge NATO without provoking Russia? Jérôme Legrand thinks that we should perhaps have a different mindset in Europe. We often forget that our way of life is seen by the Kremlin as an existential threat for theirs. So, these are a bit of thoughts that go in our audience, and perhaps I can go back to the panel and ask for your opinions. Natalia, why don't I start with you?
Sure. I think I have a couple of thoughts on this. So first of all, on the point of provocation, if you actually look back to the Kremlin's policy starting since 90s, the efforts to reintegrate countries in the former Soviet Union, not in the formal sense, but establish a dominant position, started way before NATO accepted new members. And I think it's a really important point to stress. I think secondly, we also should not forget that there was a reset effort from US with Russia that happened a few years before the illegal occupation of Crimea. And we can talk about it, this narrative of Russia being provoked more extensively, if you like. I think second point in terms of provoking Russia and Russia responding to force versus diplomacy. We've actually seen evidence multiple times that when Kremlin is pushed back, it rolls back. Ukraine is actually a great example of this. They initially wanted to capture 6 regions in southern and eastern Ukraine. They barely got 2 portions of 2 regions. And that's their core theater, the place where they have the largest number of assets, intelligence. They still stopped because they actually had major intelligence failures, miscalculated, and had to roll back. Turkey is another example. Turkey is challenging Russia across theaters, not just in Syria, but also in Libya. Now, of course, we have another instance in Caucasus. Russia is not pushing back. And actually, Turkey did manage to put Russia on defensive in Libya. Russia did effectively counteract that, and they managed to freeze the front line. But nevertheless, there was a period where Russia was actually on the defensive. And final point I will mention is, it goes back to the initial question of strength and sources of resilience, but also weaknesses. Russia for sure has undeniable strengths, but they're limited. A lot of times their value proposition is actually quite weak. And Russia really tried but failed to stop integration of Balkans into the Western structures. Another place where they were actually rolled back, in part by efforts from the West, but also countries within the Balkans that just, Russia couldn't offer them enough. They have a reality problem. So I fully understand the narrative of being provoked and diplomacy, but the evidence also points that the force does work.
Teija, would you like to react to that as well?
I think your formulation that democracy is an essential threat to Russia was very good. And what are the consequences to us? I think we should ask ourselves: should we limit our contacts and dialogue with democratic movements or groups in the Eastern Partnership countries, Belarus included? I don't think we should. I understand from the question that yes, this is a tricky question, and we all remember how the crisis on Ukraine started, and that was all about the European Union in that case. So we can be misinterpreted by Russia on purpose, but I don't think we should. In my view, this is about starting to compromise on our values. This is, as we know, this is the challenge with autocratic systems, that when they cannot renew their legitimacy basis through the normal channel, which is, of course, democratic elections, they have to find other means for doing that, and aggressive foreign policy is one way of enhancing the legitimacy of the ruler. But from that point of view, of course, the values that would challenge the system form an essential threat. But how far should we play with those rules? That's a question that I would like to raise here in our panel, because it's really difficult. But I think we should engage in a dialogue with those parts of society that are ready to do it.
Oksana, Kimberly, Ben, should we or should we not be careful to hurt President Putin's feelings?
Yeah, I like this question very much. First of all, about the strength in diplomacy, once very famous American diplomat mentioned that diplomatic methods wins only when behind the behind the shoulders of the diplomats, big tanks are standing. So I believe this is very good formula of success. The more tanks you have behind your shoulders, the stronger you will be in diplomacy. And it's not also, I think, I don't remember the author of this proverb, but I like the statement that diplomacy is the counter-side of the war. So the war creates the reality and diplomacy interprets it. And if you don't have the military power, then diplomatically, unfortunately, you will be very weak. When it comes to the provocation, I will give you another metaphor, and it's domestic violence. So it's exactly this situation. So when we speak about this, whether we should or should not provoke Russia or Putin, it's like we are the victims of the domestic violence who are pretending not to provoke the abuser. So actually, if you live in with the person who are about to abuse you, this person will always find the grounds to do this and the reasons to do this. This is the same as with Russia. Russia should not be provoked. Russia will provoke itself very well. It can provoke itself with different groups, pro-Russian or Russia-funded and so on. So you should not care about the feeling, answering your question, you should not care about the feeling of Putin. You have to care about your freedom. And if you stand right to protect your freedom, then as Natalia absolutely comprehensively answered, then Russia will be pushed back. And thanks for this example. And I do remember that in 2014, when Russia started the aggressive campaign in Ukraine, most of the international partners, they were calling Ukrainian people not to provoke. Please don't stand up and don't fight, because it will be worse. Don't provoke Russia. And I'm so proud of Ukrainian people that they actually stood up and went to fight. And that's why we still have the country. Otherwise, we would actually, probably we would collapse. So yes, you have to stand up and fight and take care of your freedom. And then Russia will be contained. Thank you.
Kim.
First and foremost, I'm distressed that we're having this conversation on Putin's terms. If we are talking about his feelings, then and asking about what we are doing actually to provoke him, we are accepting the narrative that he has worked so hard to create in the period really from 2006, 2007 onward. That's the first thing. The second thing is that that Putin is a leader of a state, and he is operating in politics and diplomacy on the basis of his interests, not on the basis of his feelings. And we, the West, need to do the same. We have vital interests at stake in this competition. They include the health and survival of our democracies, the legitimacy of international institutions, the maintenance of international norms, and they also include the need to preserve the sovereignty of states that are recognized by the international community, and not to allow those sovereign states to be challenged and deprived of their sovereignty by the use of force by a foreign power. And these are the core interests that we have at stake. They are not the interests, they are indeed counter to the Kremlin's interests as the Kremlin defines it. And we should conduct our foreign policy and diplomacy to preserve our interests and to deprive our adversaries of the opportunity to achieve theirs.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Kimberly. And Ben? No, okay, thank you. Okay, we have about 10 to 15 minutes left in this conversation, and many questions are being asked. So I'll just take a couple of them and perhaps also specify for whom they're addressed. But in general, there's a lot of questions about, you know, as I would say sometimes, you cannot give in on Putin, but don't give up on Russia. And so there's a few questions on actually what we can do to have a dialogue with Russian society, with Russian civil society, if that's even an option, and how can we in the West better support Russian opposition political parties. So what can we do there? There's a question specifically for Natalia as well. You mentioned in your report the Russian strategy to build a network of alliances, particularly in the CIS. What can we do to you know, deter those diplomatic efforts? Was a question for you, Natalia. And I also have a question, an interesting question as well for Ben, specifically asked. Since you mentioned the Russian nuclear arsenal, there's a question for you whether the United States should extend the New START treaty. Arms control nowadays no longer seems to be in fashion. So what can we do about that? And Kim, by all means, you, I think, have the expertise on these issues as well. And last but not least, before I close this round, and this is also to all the panel in general, someone is asking, why did we actually fail to recognize the ambitions of Russia, the new ambitions of Russia in its neighborhoods? I mean, we had Georgia in 2008, we had Russia, we had Ukraine in 2014, but somehow there was not a bell ringing in our heads in the West. You know, it took us some time to understand that the Kremlin was on a war path, on an exponentialistic path. So why did it take us so long? So let me perhaps reverse the order of how we started, and Ben, kickstart with you. Thank you very much.
Hey, so let me address 3 points. First, why did it take so long to recognize what was going on? That's what this whole panel is about. It's a willingness to recognize that the Kremlin actually is a threat. And, you know, I live here in beautiful Frankfurt. I love it here. But I mean, I'm surrounded by really good people who always say, why can't we just talk with the Kremlin? You know, I mean, can't we just get along? And it's a totally unrealistic view of how the Kremlin thinks about the world and how it thinks about itself. There's nothing in history that should give us confidence that if we just talk to whoever the leader of Russia is, well, it'll all work out. There's nothing in the last at least 350 years that offers any evidence of that. So the nuclear weapons, I disagree with you, Bruno, with all respect, to say it's not in fashion, the arms control is not in fashion. What's not in fashion is the Kremlin living up to any agreement it's ever signed. So for sure, I mean, everybody in NATO, even the ones who are the most critical of the United States, agreed that Russia had been in violation of INF. Now, I personally would rather stay inside of agreements and try to fix them, all agreements, by the way, not just arms control, and use our most important ally, Germany, to put pressure on the Kremlin, because I think Germany is the only country that can actually change Kremlin behavior, because I think the Kremlin actually still worries about Germany. And they want this economic relationship, which, by the way, Germany also wants. And I think the United States, we could be much smarter and work more closely with Germany, our most important ally, to get Russia to live up to agreements that are important. The specific question was, should we extend it? Yes, actually, I think Ambassador Billingsley's been working very hard to get an extension of New START for a year to buy some more time. I personally agree that we should bring China into arms control agreements, because we're crazy to limit ourselves based on what Russia has while the Chinese continue to move along. And the last thing I'd say, the Russian people have suffered more from Russian government than anybody else, no matter how badly the Ukrainians were treated, people from Belarus, Georgia, all the other countries, the Baltics, Poland. It's the Russian people themselves have suffered more under the Tsar, the Tsarina, the Soviet Union, and now Putin. I mean, you get outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, it is pretty grim. And so I think that we should be reaching out and finding ways to support them. And the best way I can think of is for all the women of Belarus to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. That should be the recipient, to highlight what the courage and resistance, peaceful resistance, looks like.
Thank you very much, Ben. Kim?
I think that we here in the United States, in any case, really do not want to see to the end of what Putin is trying to do. We want to look, as Natalia said, at each step that Putin is taking as a unique step and a small step toward a small goal, rather than actually comprehending the way in which he integrates his tools and instruments of policy to achieve long-term goals. And we're seeing this now in the work that we are doing at ISW on Belarus and on the Kremlin's very sophisticated campaign that is underway inside of Belarus to make it possible for Putin to achieve some of his long-term goals with regard to the Union State, the CSTO, and the taming, as it were, of Lukashenko. And what is so interesting to me is how hard it is, even as the terrific team of Mason Clark and George Barrows continue to write about this phenomenon, to get US policymakers actually to see that there is a sophisticated campaign underway, that Putin is trying to achieve important long-term objectives. And that simply talking about the need to support democracy in Belarus, in which I deeply believe, is insufficient, actually, to curtail Putin in his ambitions. These are hybrid tools in a campaign that is ongoing. And we really must continue to make these campaigns visible and actually suspend our own naivete for long enough actually to imagine, just imagine that we are watching a coherent series of actions, and then to think about, if that is true, what kinds of policy responses should we be taking here and now in the early stages of any such Putin operation, actually to make sure that it does not get as far as he was able to get in Ukraine and Georgia. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Oksana, the floor is all yours.
Just will try to give a few more words, and I think that the first and the last question are very much connected because it comes to one end. So why Russia has been misperceived and the threat from Russia has been misperceived? I think that one of the key mistake was to consider that in Soviet Union the threat was the ideology, the communists, but in fact it was Russia per se, and Russian policy has never been changed through the course of its history through the last 350 years. Doesn't matter how this territory has been called, whether it was Moscow Kingdom, whether it was Russian Empire, whether it was Soviet Empire, or it's now the Russian Federation. So they never changed their goals and the methods. And I think that if you, for example, read John McCloy, The Threats to American Foreign Policy of 50s, he was one of the creator of the founder of the European Union, yeah, then you will find very good statements. And if you replace the Soviets with Russians, you will actually read about the current dates. And it corresponds to Natalia's report very much, by the way. And the second reason is money. And here, I think one of the best research was done by Edward Lucas, and it was done in 2004. It was called The New Cold War. And he was writing about the threat that is coming from Russia, because Russia has been invested in all European gas companies and allowing all European gas companies to work with the Gazprom. And now those gas companies, they push on their governments and prevent those governments to speak the truth. So money works. And the third, and I think this is the most important, and the question, and this is also the answer to the question number one, that unfortunately a lot of people think that Russia can be democratized, so the Russia in current shape can be democratized. And I think that maybe it's time also to reconsider this, that if we speak about democratization of Russia, we have to assume that Russia should collapse, because democratic Russia will not be able to survive in this shape. And it's not because I think so. Look at the geography, look at the maps. Look at the Russian economy, look at the Russian history. So unfortunately, we can face the reality that democratic Russia will not be able to exist in current borders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Oksana. Teija?
Thank you so much. I also want to address two questions. This one, why did it take us so long to understand what was to come, I think is very interesting. I think it's true that we heard these warnings already in the 90s during the Yeltsin era about military sanctions in case the Baltic states would join NATO. We heard these warnings in the early 2000s. So perhaps we didn't take them seriously because nothing materialized at that stage. But I also want to refer to two enablers to changes taking place. One was, of course, Putin's own personality and the background from which he comes, his style of leadership and his personal goals. And the second is a country that we haven't mentioned in this panel this far, and that is China. The emergence of China affected other great powers and their policies and positions, and enabled Russia to take a much more aggressive position in its European neighborhood. So I think there were changes also which enabled Russia to conduct the policy that it has been doing for the past 10 years or so. There was also an important question about how do we communicate and interact with Russian civil society? What could we do? I would encourage us all to create contacts, and of course academic scientific contacts are important. The country where I come from, Finland, has a long common border with Russia. We also see a lot of cross-border cooperation, trade and tourism. This is very non-political. This has always been there. It has, of course, diminished now due to the Ukraine crisis, but yes, there is a huge important civil society in Russia, even if we cannot engage in a normal way, of course. Thank you, Bruno.
No, thank you. And last but not least, Natalia, our author of the report. The last word is for you.
Thank you, Bruno. I think I have also quick 3 thoughts. I think first, why did we miss? I think the stare on Russia has to be constant. It cannot be cyclical. When we think there's a potential reset, it has to be constant. And I think because so much of asymmetry of Putin's approach simply comes from time, from being in the Kremlin for 20 years, from being able to push the narrative for so long, from being able to benefit from the change of democratic government. So the stare has to be constant, and it goes back to the point about how important are strategic intelligence capabilities, and then they have to be embedded both within the Western societies, but also I think the West should help countries within the former Soviet Union in particular build up these analytical capabilities, because they're just as important as actually military strength. And Russia is trying to do a lot to undermine those, to make sure that they don't have this collective immunity against Russia. So I think that goes back to the question about coalitions and how we can help or deter some of Russia's coalition building efforts. The final point I will mention is that I think as we look ahead, I still assess that the gap between Putin's goals and resources will continue to grow. And the minimum that the West can do is not remove the dampeners on his ambition and not empower him involuntarily, or in some cases voluntarily. I think sanctions, despite the Kremlin's rhetoric that they do not work or make Russia stronger, are actually dampening what Russia can do. I also think that preventing solidification of some of Putin's narratives is essential, because if Putin is able to establish certain principles in the international community, for example, the principle of truncated sovereignty of the former Soviet states, or a special sovereignty principle that Russia has, well, he doesn't need to use force to achieve his objective. So I think that should be a paramount priority, and that should be a consolidated effort with the West, but also with a lot of countries that Putin is trying to establish dominant influence on in the former Soviet Union.
Thank you very much. And thank to all of you really for your remarks and your thought. I regret there's no more time for questions, but I do congratulate you on the ideas that you raised. It was a very good tour de table on what we need to discuss. And, you know, I think given the recent constitutional change in Russia, and that Putin may stay with us until 2036, we'll have ample more occasions to talk about Russia the next 16 years, hopefully in a better way, not in the terms of threat and challenges that we did today. But I really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you very much again to Natalia and Kimberly for your partnership as well. Oksana, thank you to Ben, Teija. Really appreciate your insights. Special thank you to my own team actually as well at GMF, Patricia, Alberto. Thank you for managing all that. And thank you to the viewers for joining us too. I wish you all a very good morning or a very nice end of the day. Bye-bye.